Good evening, everyone. You will be watching the presentation about potential and consequences of S&P US credit rating downgrade. This will be presented by Aista Foreman, Jeannie Taylor, and Alim Hassanov. Aista will be talking about S&P sovereign credit ratings. Jeannie will present potential of an actual downgrade, and Alim will finish with consequences. So what are S&P sovereign credit ratings? Like other credit ratings, sovereign ratings are assessments of the relative likelihood that a borrower will default on its obligations. Governments generally seek credit ratings to ease their own access to international capital markets, where many investors, particularly U.S. investors, prefer rated securities over unrated securities of apparently similar credit risk. Also, sovereign ratings are important not only because some of the largest issuers in the international capital markets are national governments, but also because these assessments affect the ratings assigned to borrowers of same nationality. Sovereign ratings does not address recovery or loss given default, although Standard & Poor's plans to introduce sovereign recovery ratings within the next year. Sovereign ratings also are not country ratings, an important and often misunderstood distinction. Thus, they do not speak specifically to exchange rate or regulatory risk or any of a host of country characteristics that affect the operating and financial environment of the private sector entity. Sovereign ratings address the credit risk of national governments, but not the specific default risk of other issuers. A rating assigned to a non-sovereign entity is most frequently the same as or lower than that assigned to the sovereign in the main country of domicile, but may be higher. Compared with corporate ratings, sovereign ratings show slightly more stability at most rating levels. The sovereign default record is lower than the corporate default record at most rating levels, but such comparisons are affected by the small number of rated sovereign defaults. Standard & Poor appraisal of each sovereign's overall creditworthiness is both quantitative and qualitative. The quantitative aspects of the analysis incorporate a number of measures of economic performance, although judging the integrity of the data is more qualitative matter. The analysis is also qualitative due to the importance of political and policy developments, and because Standard & Poor's ratings indicate future debt service capacity. Standard & Poor devised the analytical framework for sovereigns into 9 categories. The categories are political risk, income and economic structure, economic growth prospects, fiscal flexibility, general government debt burden, offshore and contingent liabilities, monetary flexibility, external liquidity, and external debt burden. As part of the committee process that Standard & Poor's uses to assign credit ratings, each sovereign is ranked on a scale of 1, the best, to 6 for each of 9 analytical categories. There is no exact formula for combining the scores to determine ratings. The analytical variables are integrated and the weights are not fixed, either across sovereigns or over time. Most categories incorporate both economic risk and political risk, the key determinants of credit risk. Economic risk addresses the government's ability to repay its obligations on time and is a function of both quantitative and qualitative factors. Political risk addresses the sovereign's willingness to repay debt. Now Jeannie will talk about the potential of the actual downgrade.
Thank you, Isa. To build on what Isa has already said, I will first discuss some local and foreign currency rating factors. The economic and political risks that S&P considers when rating local currency debt service are political institutions and trends, economic growth and structure, the government's revenue, expenditures, deficits, debt, and monetary flexibility. In rating foreign debt services, S&P uses external liquidity and trends in public and private sector debts to non-residents. Now that it is clear how ratings are assigned, we can discuss some recent changes. There's been a change in the U.S. sovereign rating. The U.S. credit rating went from stable to negative, but the U.S. was able to retain its AAA rating on U.S. sovereign debt. It is important to note that this is not equivalent to a downgrade. It's not the same thing, it's not quite as bad. Usually these type of changes occur when new information alters their views on what may actually happen in the future. The key to maintaining credit rating during negative shocks and trends is a strong policy response. So what does this rating mean? This negative rating could signify the lowering of U.S. sovereign credit over the next 6 to 24 months. According to the S&P, U.S.'s large budget deficit and their government debt is what is causing concern. However, if United States politicians come to an agreement and are able to work to lessen the deficit and reduce debt, the United States may be able to avoid a downgrade. Lynn's going to focus on the consequences that may occur if the S&P does lower the U.S. sovereign credit rating.
Thank you, Jean. And now I will go over the effects of a potential U.S. government debt downgrade. In general, a downgrade affects several areas in the economy. The first effects will have more or less of a global effect or macro effect and will occur in the bond and currency markets. In particular, the bond yields are most likely to increase with a respective decline in their prices. This would happen mostly because some institutional investors like pension funds, certain mutual funds and other large investors are required to hold only AAA rated investments. A downgrade will force them to sell and liquidate their U.S. government holdings, and since the U.S. debt is one of the most broadly held and trusted investment throughout the world, the short-term effect will be rather sharp. Another effect related to the downgrade will be increased risk aversion, which will lower equity prices and increase the value of more conservative investments like gold. One of the most prominent results of a downgrade will be the depreciation of the dollar and increase in volatility. Actually, the process could have started ahead of an actual downgrade. This chart shows the value of the dollar index for the last 12 months. Practically, this will result from the sale of US-dominated assets, including US bonds, which will obligate international investors to convert the extra dollars into their home currency or another third currency where they will invest their cash. The second major result of a downgrade will affect, of course, the domestic economy. In particular, every investment or financial instrument that is related or attached to the yields of the U.S. Treasuries will be affected directly. For example, mortgage rates, credit card interest rates will rise. Another domestic effect of the downgrade will include higher corporate financing costs for companies. This is due to the fact that rating agencies usually don't rate entities from the same nationality with a higher rating, and this will force them to downgrade the US corporate bonds as well. In other words, companies highly active in the capital markets will have their capital costs increased, and this will lead to, as mentioned earlier in decline of US-based equity prices. Here I want to just point out that the US corporations are relatively less indebted compared to the federal government. Therefore, the effects on the private sector will be somewhat less severe. Another third major effect of the downgrade will be the include the U.S. government financing costs, including also the local and state governments. The price for financing and refinancing of current debt will increase in the long term. This will have to be compensated by cuts in the federal and state budgets, combined with increased revenue from taxes. This chart shows the projected US debt for the next decade, as estimated by the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. The downgrade will probably increase the projections even further. In conclusion, looking back to history, after similar national debt downgrades, the initial harsh effects are usually short-lived. Since markets anticipate the downgrade will in advance, the actual downgrade just makes the economic and financial difficulties somehow just official. The economy is usually continuing their projected path unless the government doesn't undertake decisive measures to change the course of the economy. Thanks for listening and watching.